old sanctuary building, and I've been very critical of it. And as I was praying this week, and I was freezing and I could see my breath, it reminded me that actually I've been a little short-sighted in doing that, because this church, Ion Church, has let us use this space. This is a very big space, obviously, too big for our little group, but nonetheless, they let us use it, and they donate the space for us, and they do so with a really gracious heart. And I promise you this, I'm not going to be critical of this old rickety sanctuary anymore. I'm actually going to appreciate it, because I was praying and I was thinking, you know, when I'm gone from here, maybe 5 years now, for whatever, I'm going to look back on this time and realize that the imperfections were actually the perfections. The imperfections of this old rickety sanctuary are actually the perfections, because I know it's cold, and in the summertime it gets hot, and you know, we have to deal with it. We get 2 seasons of good weather, and the sanctuary is comfortable, and then the keyboard goes out, or the microphones go out, or something or other. But it's in those imperfections where I find the perfections. I find God perfectly working out through worship here in this community of people from all over the globe. I mean, people from everywhere who gather here and are able to come together and worship and see the perfection of God being worked out in a community, even in an imperfect, old, rickety sanctuary. So I promise you this, I will not criticize the sanctuary, although I know it's cold, and even in the summertime, I won't curse it when it's hot and I'm up here sweating and you're out there nice and cool with the air conditioning. I won't do it, because it's in those imperfections that we find the perfections working out. And I know years from now I'll look back at this old place and appreciate it. And I hope you can too. The passage today is going to come from Matthew 18. The primary passage is from Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 through 35, and then a supplementary passage from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, starting at verse 4. So let me read the passage of Matthew, and you can follow along up there. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I'll pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii, and he grabbed him and he began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me, and I will pay it back. But he refused. Instead, he went off, and he had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged, and they went, and they told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in, the first servant. He says, you wicked servant, I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or your sister from your heart. And reading from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. This is the word of the Lord. Now, if you've been here the last few weeks, of course, we were doing a series on our vision for this community and what we are thinking of our vision going forward. We talked about things like being an international community, which means sacrificing our cultural values for one another since we come from all over the globe. We talked about being a grace-giving community, which means giving grace to someone even in the time in which you're in the most conflict with them. We talked about things like being gospel-focused, which it means focusing on what Jesus did for you, not what you do to please God, how God ran towards you, not how you earn your way towards God. And all these things are very, very great. They're sort of like being in an airplane and looking down at the earth. You get a good view of it, right? Of all the plots of land and of the bodies of water from a very high view. But it's another thing entirely to land the plane, get down and touch the grass and touch the water. So we were looking at our visions from sort of this high level view. You can think of it like an impressionist painting, a Monet. You see it in the museum, and from a distance you can see what look like broad brushstrokes. You can see the lily pads in the house and whatever else he has painted. It's only when you get closer to the painting that you start to see the small paint marks, the dots, the smudges. You start to get the detail. So what I wanted to do after we looked through our vision for the last 6-7 weeks, I wanted to take it from the airplane and go down to the ground and get very, very, very practical with our community here. And we're starting a new series which we're going to be looking at the character that God wants us to embody. Not just the vision, but the character. Now, a lot of you have given me feedback on my sermons, which I always appreciate. Not right after the sermon. Again, remember, wait a couple days, then come to me. And I appreciate that. And what I've heard from most people is that I tend to be intellectual. I'm hoping that's a compliment. But even so, what I'm going to try to do with this series, I'm going to try not to be intellectual. I'm not going to be emotional, because I'm not an emotional kind of guy. But I'm going to try not to be intellectual. I'm actually going to try to get us to be very, very practical with this particular sermon series. Because what I want to look at is, if this is our vision, all those things that we've gone through the last 6 or 7 weeks, how does it translate to actual character? Because I know you guys have to go to work tomorrow, and you got to start thinking about your character and who you are as a person, and do you want to grow, and do you want to develop that? And so I want to look at character traits that God calls us to. Now, why did I read 1 Corinthians? You know, if you've been a Christian, you know this passage, 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And if you're from America, or maybe even other countries do this, of course, this is a famous passage that's read at weddings, right? Love is patient, love is kind. And it wasn't read at my wedding, but if it was read at your wedding, great. But I'm here to tell you, people think that this is supposed to be what love looks like between a man and a woman in marriage. And it is. It's great to do that. Don't get me wrong. It has a great place at weddings, but that's not what Paul was saying here. And the reason why we know is because in Greek, sorry, I'm being intellectual for 1 second. In Greek, when he says love is patient, love is kind, those aren't adjectives. Those are verbs. What he's saying is, a better English translation would be love patiented, which isn't even an English word. Love kinded. It's not even an English word either. See, that's why the writers, when they translate it, have to say that love is patient, love is kind. But Paul's not talking about some general abstract idea of love. No, he's talking about someone or something who did these things. He's using verbs because he's talking about a person. And in the context of 1 Corinthians, you can read it back, he's talking about Jesus. And he's saying, if you want to follow this guy named Jesus, if you want to call yourself a Christian, you have to know a little bit about his character. He's saying, Jesus was patient. Jesus was the kind one. Jesus did these things. This is Jesus' character. And it's not a passage just about love, but it's a passage about Christian character and who you and I can be if we want to cultivate character. Now, if you think that you're an okay person, then the sermon's not for you. If you think that you don't need to change, that you don't need to grow, then just tune me out for the next 25, 30 minutes. But what we're going to be looking at in the parables, and this is why I read this particular parable, is every week I want to look at a different parable about what Jesus says about Christian character. And he gets very, very practical. He gets very practical talking about issues of patience, which we're going to look at today, and humility, and generosity, and confidence, which is interesting. Remember, it says love always perseveres. So what Paul was talking about is character, and what Jesus does in his parables is he's talking about character too. And he's saying this: if you want to follow me, if you want to call yourself a Christian, This is the type of character you should be cultivating. Doesn't mean you're going to get it right. Obviously, we're talking about patience today. You and I are not going to ever be the most patient people in the world. We're never going to be perfect. But yet he says you should be cultivating a character of patience. You should be growing it and tilling the soil of your heart to where character and patience is growing and developing. I'm going to make a prediction here. Halfway through this message, here's my prediction. Halfway through, you're probably going to say or think to yourself, and I can probably tell by looking at your eyes if your eyes are starting to roll back. You're probably either going to think one of two things. Either what I'm saying here, what I'm about to say is either completely impossible or it's completely insane. I promise this. You'll think either what I'm about to tell you, what Jesus was saying about patience is either completely impossible to do, or if you were to do it, you'd be the biggest pushover in the world. Everybody would run all over you. And you're going to probably metaphorically or figuratively throw your hands up and say, well, what's the point of this? And the reason why I think you're going to say that, at least the reason why I thought that when I first read this passage, and the reason why I'm calling this series The Character of the Upside Down Kingdom, is because the kingdom of God gives us a character and gives us a type of inner value system that runs completely counter to the world around it. When Jesus talks about patience, he does so, and you'll see in a little bit, in a way that most people in the world, the way that we're trained to think about patience, it runs completely opposite to it. Jesus gives these parables that most of his listeners would have heard and said, what are you, that is impossible to do. And he gives us a parable today of what's called the unmerciful servant. And he's talking about patience. And I want to look at three things. First, what is patience? What kills patience, and what makes patience? I mean, hopefully, the small group that we are here today, hopefully we all want to become more patient people. I know I do personally. It's always something that's on my top of my list. Be more patient. Be more patient. In my marriage or in your relationships with your family, at your schools, at your work, we should strive for patience. And here Jesus gives us this beautiful, beautiful picture. An upside-down picture of what patience looks like. So let's jump into it. What is patience? What kills it? And what makes it? First, what is patience? Patience, you notice the servant here. He comes to his master when he owes him 10,000 talents. And I'll explain how much that is in a little bit. He runs to him with this enormous debt. And what does he say to him? He says, be patient with me. The servant begs for patience. And so what Jesus wants us to see is that what the king does is exhibit patience to the servant. And what does the king do? Patience at the heart of it really is nothing more than forgiveness. Patience, when you and I show patience towards one another, or towards our spouse, or towards anybody, it's really doing small acts of forgiveness. That's what the king does here. He forgives. Therefore, that's what patience is. Think about it, I'll give you two examples, a small one and a big one. When you have patience with a 2-year-old who's having a temper tantrum in the corner of your house, you probably know that I'm talking about my daughter now, stamping their feet, crying and not doing what you want, and you're having patience. What are you doing? What am I doing when I do that? All I'm doing is I'm forgiving my daughter. And I'm forgiving her for taking away my authority, because if you've ever had a 2-year-old have a tantrum, you know that you have no authority at that time. And it angers you because you want authority over this 2-year-old. You want them to stop, and they don't. And so having patience with a temper tantrum 2-year-old really is just having forgiveness for them. It's saying in your heart, I'm going to forgive this little one for taking away my power and my authority right now. And that's a small example. And a bigger example, when you have patience towards God, when you're impatient towards God, all that is our inability to forgive God. We say to God, I know the way my life should be going, and you're not fulfilling your end of the bargain. You're not making it happen. And you don't forgive God, and therefore you don't have patience towards him. In this parable, the king shows patience because he forgives. And specifically, the king does three things that I'm going to run through rather quickly to give an idea of what patience looks like in this upside-down world, how radically different Jesus' version of patience is than what the world presents. First, what does the king do? He does three things. First, he has pity on him, he cancels his debt, and he lets him go. Now, what does that mean? He has pity on him. I hate this English translation because it sounds like the king's looking at him going, oh, you stupid little servant. And he's not. There's an English expression that's better, and it captures this. It would say something like, the king's heart went out to the servant. I wish the writers would have translated it that way. Pity sounds condescending. But what the king does, he doesn't say, he says, and actually this is the same verb used about Jesus when talking many times about Jesus' compassion. It says the king's heart went out to him. Now what does this mean? It means the king could empathize with him. The king looked at the servant and for that moment didn't say, I'm king, you're the servant, bow down to worship me. Rather, he said, let me figure out where this servant's coming from. Let me try to know this servant's heart a little bit. See, that's the first step for forgiveness for you and I. That's the first step for having patience, is the ability to look at someone who wrongs you, somebody who's done something against you. And before you start to act in revenge, before we start to act into anger, we take pity, or rather our heart goes out to that person. Remember I told you, you're either going to think this is completely impossible or completely insane. It's going to get even more impossible. The king has pity. His heart goes out to him. It melts for this servant. But he does something even better. He says the king canceled his debt. Now, what does this mean? He says 10,000 talents. The servant owed him 10,000 talents. Put that in perspective. 1 talent would have been equal to 20 years of wages for a day laborer. Okay? 1 talent is equal to 20 years of salary. So take your salary for the next 20 years, and that's just 1 talent. And it says that the servant owed the king 10,000 talents. Now, I'm sure this is a number, if you translate it into U.S. currency, it's something like trillions and trillions of dollars or something like that. And what Jesus is trying to nail home here is this. When the king forgives the servant, when the king has pity on him, he not only feels emotion, but he acts on an action, and he cancels the debt, and he pays it down. And this means that you and I, whenever we have conflict with one another, if we're going to show patience towards one another, if we're going to be patient people, we have to be willing to buy down the debt of our own anger in that very moment that we feel the most anger towards the other person. Let me say it this way. I have 2 brothers and a sister, but I have one brother who I was very close to, 2 years older than I was. And we lived in New York City together, and we borrowed everything. I mostly borrowed his clothes, and he mostly borrowed my electronics. I don't know why it worked out that way. Maybe I think he always dressed better than I did, and I could always find better electronics than he could. Now, I have this unique, talent, it is. I destroy clothing. I don't know how this happens, but it doesn't matter what I wear. A t-shirt, a pair of jeans, inevitably it gets ripped. There's holes in it. Of course, my wife's always pointing it out. Throw that thing away. Get rid of it. I have this weird ability to utterly destroy any clothing that I wear, and I do it very, very quickly. Now, my brother, on the other hand, he has a unique ability to destroy any electronic device that he gets his hands on. I don't know how he does this. We used to call him Magneto because we said that every time he touched something, a computer or anything that he would borrow, inevitably this electronic would break. Now, imagine this scenario. You got 2 brothers. I'm borrowing his clothes. He's borrowing my electronics. And I remember I would take his shoes back to him, and they would have holes in them. And he said, you've had these things for 2 weeks. How do you have holes in shoes after 2 weeks? I don't even know how I did it. It's like a new talent I developed. And I remember one time he returned to me this calculator, a solar calculator. Solar, it runs on the sun. And he broke it. I don't even know how you do that. It has no real electronic components, and yet somehow he destroyed it. Now, when he did that, of course I was angry. He destroyed a computer of mine one time, and I was angry. Now, here's the deal. In those times when I return the clothing back to him and he returns the electronics back to me, one of us is going to have to pay that cost. Practically speaking, if he destroyed my solar calculator, either he buys me a new one, I buy a new one, or I go without it. And this is what Jesus is saying in the parable here. When the king cancels the debt, he says, and every time that you and I have conflict with one another, we're going to have to pay down that debt as Christians. You have to pay down your anger. You are going to have to suffer the cost of that. Either you suffer it or you make the other person suffer it. But here's what I'll promise you. If you make the other person suffer it, it won't help you one bit. That's just revenge. I could have made my brother suffer the cost of buying down a new computer, but that's just revenge. And Jesus says, no, the character of true Christian patience is the ability to cancel the debt of the other person. And think of what it would have meant for this king. Remember I said 1 talent was 20 years of salary, and this person owed 10,000. What Jesus is trying to communicate is that for the king to forgive that debt would have meant an utter destruction of the king's kingdom. It would have meant the king sacrificed his vacations, his kids' school tuition. The king would have had to give up all of that to buy down the debt of this particular servant. And Jesus says, if you and I want to develop character, a character of patience, we have to be willing to buy down that. Our heart has to go out to the person, but we have to be willing to buy that down. If we don't, you and I will always be stuck in revenge mode. When somebody wrongs us, we'll want to attack and make them pay the debt. But I guarantee you, it won't make you better. It won't make you happier. Jesus says, no. In conflict, to show patience and forgiveness means you buy down the debt. But he goes even further, and he says something else that's very interesting. He says, the king let him go, right? Now, just before you start thinking that I'm advocating some sort of passive, aggressive, forgive the people, let them run all over you again and again and again, I'm not. That's not what Jesus says. He says the king let him go. And the servant goes out, and the servant looks at his other servant, and he asks for that money to be paid to him. And what Jesus is saying here is when you and I show patience towards one another, when we forgive our spouses or our families or our friends, whoever wrongs us, when we pay down that debt, it doesn't mean that we let that person continue doing what they've always been doing to hurt us. Because the king says, I'm going to let you go. I'm going to trust you to go out and show forgiveness the same way I showed forgiveness to you. Of course, the servant doesn't do it. The king comes back and says, you didn't understand my forgiveness. I'm taking it back. What Jesus is saying here is, really quickly, and I'm going to move on, don't be a pushover. Don't be a pushover. This Christian forgiveness and patience doesn't mean you let everybody run all over you. Because if you forgive someone or if you show patience towards them, and yet they keep doing the same destructive thing over and over again, that's nothing. That will never help the person. That'll never help you. You remember, you might have seen the movie The Color Purple. This is much more pronounced in the book than, I guess, in the movie, although it's been a long time since I've seen the movie. You remember there's a character, Harpo, and he's a man, and he, in the book, he grows up, and he's sort of a weak-willed man. He can't get anybody to do what he wants. He tells people to do things, nobody listens to him. And he marries Sophia, who in the movies played by Oprah Winfrey. And he marries Sophia. Now, Sophia is a very strong woman, and she will not take anything from any man. And if you read the book, Through the Color Purple, it's all about African Americans and their community, and there's a lot of abuse. The husbands beat the wives, and that's how they get the wives to do things. Now, Harpo, he wants to get Sophia to do things for him, to be like all the other wives, submissive. He wants to be dominant. And yet, he keeps failing in it. He keeps trying to abuse her, but she will not stand for it. She won't tolerate it. And there's that famous line where Sophia is talking to her friend Sally. And Sally asks her, why don't you just do what Harpo says? Why do you fight back? Because, of course, Sally has been beaten her entire life and abused. And she's beaten by her husband. And she does everything that he wants her to do. And Sophia says, I've been beaten my whole life. My dad beat me, my uncle beat me, my brothers beat me. And I'm not going to let Harpo become like them. See, Sophia was taking a stand. There's patience, yes, but Sophia was saying there's a limit to it. She saw Harpo, and she saw the character. He was fundamentally a good guy. But he was being told that in order to get his way, he had to assert power and authority. He had to beat his wife. And so he has that famous line, she says, I love me Harpo, but I'm going to kill him if he tries to beat me. And what she's trying to say is, I can't stand it because I want his character to be strong. And in the same way, when the king lets the servant go, he's saying, don't let everybody run all over you. That's not Christian patience. That's being a doormat. That's being a footstool. That's not patience. Patience is forgiveness. Patience is buying down the cost. Now, hopefully, you feel that might be impossible to do. As I reflected on this, I said, this is impossible. I'm supposed to buy down the cost of my anger every time somebody wrongs me? I'm supposed to swallow it? Never. And the reason why that seems impossible is because our worldview says that it's impossible. What kills patience? What kills forgiveness in our lives? It's really just two things. In one word, it's pride. Our pride kills our patience. And how does it do it? Here it is. I'll be very practical. When you are angry at someone, you're either going to do one of two things to them. And this is what happens in the parable. You're either going to make the other person a cartoon, or you're going to make the other person a slave. You're either going to make the other person a cartoon or a slave, and that'll keep you from forgiving the person. That'll keep you from having patience for this other person who's wronged you. What do I mean by cartoon? Cartoons, of course, are one-dimensional. And if you've ever had somebody draw a cartoon of you, even if they're being very nice to you, the cartoon will exaggerate something of your facial characteristics, okay? So if you have a big nose, the cartoonist will probably make your nose even bigger. If you, like some of us, don't have a lot of hair, the cartoonist will make you look like you have even less hair. They're trying to exaggerate certain characteristics. And when you and I are in conflict with one another, we make cartoons out of the other person because it helps us deal with them. It helps us to avoid forgiveness. And what do I mean by that? Here's an example. When somebody lies, you say they're a liar. But when you lie, it's complicated, right? See, when the other person lies, we say, they're lying because they're a liar. But when we lie, we say, well, I know I wasn't supposed to lie, but it's complicated. There's a lot of variables. You don't know the whole story. There's context. You know, we wash it away. When somebody else is mean, we say, they're mean because they're just an evil person. When we're mean, we say, well, you know, it's not black and white. See, it's easy to make the other person a cartoon, to make them one-dimensional. And to write them off and to say, this is why I'm not going to forgive them, because they are a liar, and that's all they are. And the servant here, that's what he does, but he goes even further. The servant in this story makes the other person a slave. See, the parable, it says the one servant who is forgiven goes to his fellow servant, meaning they were equals. And yet he demands the payment for him, which was far less than what he owed the king. What the servant's doing here is he's unable to forgive. Why? Because he's making his fellow servant a slave underneath him. This servant is acting as if he's the king, and the other person's a slave. If you and I refuse to give patience or forgiveness towards one another or towards people who wrong us, all we're really doing is we're either making them a cartoon character, one-dimensional, labeling them and pushing them away, or we're trying to make them a slave at our feet to say, you wronged me, now pay it back. The king lost everything for his servant, and yet the servant wanted to make himself the king. And here's a really, I'm going to try to be very practical. Here's a practical way. When you know that you've made yourself the king and the other person a slave, think about your pet peeves. Okay, do you know what a pet peeve is? A pet peeve means something that bothers you and other people. Something that bothers you specifically in other people, that you just can't tolerate. Okay? If you want to know what's behind your pet peeve is really you making yourself the king and making the other person a slave. For example, my pet peeve are bad drivers. I cannot stand bad drivers, especially here in Seoul when it seems like most people look at the street signs as decorative art rather than an actual law. It bothers me when people run red lights, when they don't use turn signals, and I'm in my car complaining all the time. What am I doing? I'm the king. I'm the king of the road. Why? Because I think I'm the best driver. I really do. I really think I'm a really, really good driver. And here's what I do, honestly. When somebody in front of me doesn't use a turn signal, I say they're being reckless. When I don't use a turn signal, I say it's a soft turn. I don't really need to use it. I know what I'm doing. See, our pet peeves expose ways in which you and I make ourselves the king and we make the other person a slave. If you're always on time, you hate people who are late. Why? Because you say, well, I'm good. I'm always on time. I'm a responsible person. There I have the problems. Whatever your pet peeve may be, what it is essentially is you making the other person a slave and making yourself the king. And it will kill patience. This is why I have no patience when I drive in the car. And it's a character trait I need to cultivate. That's why I'm preaching the sermon to myself today, too. But even in the big things, in conflict in life, we know that in order to have patience with one another, we have to get beyond seeing the other person as a cartoon or only as a slave. Now, what makes patience? There's a quote in the back of your bulletin by Lewis Smedes, who's a guy I look up to a lot. And he says this about forgiveness. He says, to forgive is to set a prisoner free and discover that the prisoner was you. Now, in the context of what he's saying, it actually could be phrased this way. To forgive is to set a prisoner free and to realize that the entire time you were the prisoner. You're no better, no worse than the person who you're setting free. And what he says here is, in order for you to be